300 of the wealthiest, most dangerous people in the city stood frozen in a gold-drenched ballroom, watching a man everyone feared choose the one woman nobody expected. Champagne glasses hung midair. A senator's wife forgot to close her mouth. Somewhere near the string quartet, a rival Don's son muttered a word nobody caught, because Valen Moretti had just walked past every heiress in the room, past the ambassador's daughter, past the woman his own consigliere had been grooming as a match for 8 months, and grabbed the wrist of his maid instead. Her name was Seraphine Vale. An hour earlier, she'd been refilling ice buckets in the kitchen, apron dusted with flour, hoping nobody important would notice her. Now Valen's hand was wrapped around her wrist like he owned the right to it, and he was pulling her onto the marble dance floor in front of everyone who mattered in his world. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of 200 stares. "Dancing," he said. Nothing more, as if that single word explained the unthinkable. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody in that room had the nerve. Men who controlled ports, judges, entire city blocks stood there in silence, because the one truth everyone understood was this: Valen Moretti did not do anything without a reason, and whatever this was, it terrified them more than any weapon he'd ever pointed their way. If you're new here, you should know something about this story before we go any further. It isn't really about a gala, or a scandal, or even a dance. It's about a man who buried his heart so deep he thought nobody would ever dig it back up, and a woman who never once tried to. That's what makes what happens next so hard to look away from.
Rewind 3 years, and you'd find a very different Valen. Cold, precise. A man who ran his family's empire the way a surgeon runs an operating table. No wasted movement, no emotion allowed near the blade. His marriage had ended in a way the tabloids only ever hinted at, a betrayal so calculated that he stopped attending his own family's social functions for the better part of a year. Money couldn't fix what happened to him. Power certainly hadn't. So he did what men like him always do. He doubled down on both and let everything soft in him die quietly where nobody could see it happen. That's the man who hired Seraphine Vale 8 months before the Scala. Not personally. His household staff handled hiring, and nobody expected the boss to ever learn a new maid's name, let alone remember it. She came with no references worth mentioning, a quiet resume, and an even quieter presence that made her practically invisible in a house built for people who wanted to be seen. Which is exactly why nobody understood what happened next. Because somewhere in those 8 months, something shifted. The staff noticed it before anyone with real power did. Small things, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Valen started arriving home earlier. He'd linger in hallways where he had no reason to walk. Once, a bodyguard swore he saw the boss carry his own coffee cup back to the kitchen just so he could hand it to her instead of leaving it for someone else to collect. None of it added up to anything provable. None of it explained why, on the night of the biggest gala his family had hosted in a decade, he'd scan an entire room full of the country's most powerful people and fix his attention on the one person in the building who wasn't supposed to matter at all. Here's what almost nobody in that ballroom knew, and what you're about to learn before most of them ever will. Seraphine wasn't hiding a secret about a boyfriend or a past mistake or a scandal from some other city. What she was hiding went back further than that, back to a name that had once meant something in the underworld, a name tied to blood that had never stopped being spilled over it. And Valen? He'd known exactly who she was since the very first night she walked through his mansion doors. He just never told her. That single fact, buried under 8 months of silence, is the fuse burning underneath everything you're about to watch unfold. Because when the truth surfaces, and it will, it won't just threaten the fragile thing growing between them. It'll expose a conspiracy that reaches into Valen's own shattered marriage, into a murder nobody ever solved, and into the ambitions of someone standing in that very ballroom, smiling, clapping along with everyone else, waiting for her moment. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where this really started. Not with a dance, but with a girl standing at a service entrance on a rainy Tuesday, gripping a suitcase held together with tape, about to walk into a house that would change the rest of her life. She didn't know his name yet, not really. She'd heard it whispered in the way people whisper about weather systems or wildfires, something powerful, something to stay clear of. Valen Moretti ran half the city from behind closed doors, and the other half feared what he could do to them if he ever opened one. Seraphine needed the job too badly to care about reputations. Rent was due, her landlord wasn't patient, and the woman who ran the household staff hadn't asked many questions when Seraphine showed up with a folder of forged references and a story that didn't quite hold together if you pushed on it. Nobody pushed. Mansion staff turned over fast in that house. People came, people left, and the ones who stayed learned not to ask why.
What none of them knew, what nobody in that entire household suspected for even a second, was that the timid new maid folding towels in the East Wing carried a bloodline that half the underworld believed had died out entirely 11 years earlier. And somebody was still looking for her. The first time Valen actually saw her, really saw her, not just registered another staff member moving through his periphery, was 3 weeks into her employment, on a night he wasn't supposed to be home. A deal had fallen apart in another part of the city. He'd come back early, jaw tight, coat still smelling like gunmetal and rain, ready to disappear into his study and drink until the anger burned itself out. Instead, he found Seraphine kneeling in the hallway outside his office, gathering shattered pieces of a vase some careless guest had knocked over earlier that day. She didn't hear him approach. Glass clinked softly against her palm as she worked, careful, unhurried, like the mess didn't annoy her the way it would annoy someone who wanted to be anywhere else. "Leave it," he said. She startled, nearly dropped the shard in her hand. When she looked up at him, he expected fear, the same reflexive terror every new hire showed him for at least the first year. Instead, he got something quieter, steadier. She studied his face like she was trying to read weather patterns, not looking away, not shrinking down the way everyone else in his life had trained themselves to do. "It'll only take a minute," she said. He didn't respond. He also didn't leave. For reasons he couldn't explain to himself later, he stood in that hallway and watched a maid finish sweeping up broken glass, and something in his chest, something he'd assumed was permanently switched off, flickered back to life for exactly as long as it took her to stand and murmur a quiet goodnight. That was the beginning. Not fireworks, not some cinematic collision of eyes across a crowded room, just a man noticing, for the first time in years, that another human being in his house wasn't performing fear or ambition around him. She was simply herself, whoever that was. Little did he know that single hallway encounter would unravel 3 years of carefully constructed emotional armor. Over the following months, small moments accumulated the way snow does before an avalanche, quiet, easy to miss, catastrophic once you finally noticed how much had piled up. He'd find reasons to walk past the kitchen at the hour she took her break. She'd leave a second cup of tea on his desk without being asked, having noticed he preferred it over coffee after long nights. Neither of them called it anything. Neither of them was foolish enough to believe it could survive being named out loud. You have to understand something about Valen's world to understand why this mattered so much. Men in his position didn't fall for household staff. It wasn't a rule written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. Everyone simply knew that alliances were built through marriages between powerful families, that love was a luxury reserved for people who didn't run empires built on other people's fear. Valen had learned that lesson already, once, catastrophically, when his own marriage collapsed under the weight of a betrayal he still couldn't fully explain even to himself. His ex-wife hadn't just left him. She'd humiliated him in ways calculated to be permanent, leaking information that damaged 3 of his family's most important alliances, walking away with a settlement that felt less like compensation and more like a trophy. For 2 years afterward, Valen didn't let a single woman close enough to matter. Bodyguards joked quietly that he'd rather negotiate with a rival cartel than sit through a dinner with someone his family tried to set him up with. Seraphine never tried to get close. That, more than anything, might be exactly why she succeeded where every calculated heiress had failed. She wasn't angling for anything. She flinched at the size of his house the way someone unfamiliar with wealth actually flinches, not performing modesty for effect.
When she spoke to him, she asked about his day like the answer genuinely mattered to her, not like she was mining for information to sell later. Valen had spent 3 years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Seraphine appeared to want nothing at all, and that made her the most dangerous person he'd let near himself in years. Dangerous to the walls he'd built, if nothing else.
Here's where you need to start paying close attention, because this is where the breadcrumbs begin. Twice during those first months, Valen caught Seraphine staring at old newspaper clippings his housekeeper kept in a drawer nobody was supposed to open. Articles about a crime family wiped out over a decade earlier, a father murdered in an ambush that was never solved, a daughter who vanished from every official record afterward and was presumed dead by everyone except the small handful of people who'd bothered to keep looking. He never asked her about it, not directly, but he started watching her more carefully after that, noticing details he'd overlooked before. The careful way she avoided cameras at household events, how she flinched at a particular last name mentioned once at dinner, the fact that her forged employment references, when he finally had someone quietly check them, led nowhere at all. Valen Moretti hadn't survived this long in his world by ignoring inconvenient patterns. Within a month of noticing, he knew exactly who she was. He said nothing. Instead, he did something that would have shocked every rival, every ally, every enemy who thought they understood him. He started protecting her without ever revealing that he knew. Extra security rotations that happened to cover the servants' wing. A background check on every new hire in the house, run quietly, thoroughly, searching for anyone who might have been planted to get close to her. A promise he made to himself, if not to her, that whatever she was hiding from, it would not find her while she lived under his roof. He told himself it was simple caution, a man protecting an asset, nothing more. It took him considerably longer than it should have to admit that wasn't the truth at all, that somewhere in those quiet hallway moments and unspoken cups of tea, he'd started falling for a woman whose real name he already knew, and whose trust he was risking every single day by not telling her he knew it. That tension, the growing pull between them, shadowed by a secret only one of them carried, is what set the stage for the gala, for the night 300 guests would watch him do the unthinkable. Because by then, Violin wasn't choosing a maid over a room full of powerful women. He was choosing the one person who'd made him feel human again. Consequences be damned. Word travels fast in a world built on whispers, and it didn't take long for the wrong people to start noticing the way Violin Moretti looked at his own maid. It started as jokes among the household staff, harmless at first, a cook teasing Seraphine about the extra attention, a bodyguard placing a quiet bet with another about how long it would take the boss to admit something everyone could already see. But jokes travel, and eventually they reached ears that weren't nearly as harmless. Mafia wives at dinner parties, rival family lieutenants gathering intelligence the way they always did, looking for any weakness in Violin's armor they could exploit. By the time whispers reached Alina Castellano, a woman whose family had been circling an alliance with the Morettis for over a year, the story had grown teeth. "He's spending time with the help," Alina said one evening, swirling wine in a glass while she studied Violin across a dinner table that was supposed to be about brokering a marriage contract, not exposing one. "Is that supposed to concern me, Violin, or amuse me?" "It's not your concern," he said flatly. "Everything about your empire is my family's concern once we're bound to it." Alina set her glass down with a precision that felt more like a threat than table manners. "A maid, Violin. Do you understand what that does to your position? To ours?" He didn't answer her that night. He also didn't stop what had already started between himself and Seraphine, no matter how many warnings arrived dressed up as concern. Seraphine felt the shift before anyone explained it to her. Household staff who used to greet her warmly started keeping their distance, wary of being associated with whatever storm was building around her. A senior housekeeper pulled her aside one afternoon, voice low, urgent. "Whatever's happening between you and Mr. Moretti," the woman said, "you need to end it. Now, before it ends you instead." "Nothing's happening," Seraphine lied, though even she didn't fully believe the words as she said them. The housekeeper's expression didn't soften. "People like us don't get happy endings with men like him. We get used or we get erased.
sometimes both. That warning should have been enough to make Seraphine retreat into the safety of invisibility she'd spent years perfecting. Instead, it planted a different kind of fear in her. Not fear of Valen, but fear of losing something she hadn't even let herself name yet. Their private moments grew bolder after that, almost defiantly so. Late-night conversations in the mansion's empty library, where Valen would set aside whatever ledger he'd been reviewing just to listen to her talk about nothing important at all. A book she was reading, a memory from a childhood she rarely discussed, small fragments of a life she kept mostly hidden. He learned to recognize the particular quiet that settled over her whenever conversations drifted too close to her past, and instead of pushing, he simply let the silence stand, giving her room to keep her secrets a little longer. It didn't take long before their two worlds tried violently to remind them why this couldn't last. A rival family, sensing weakness, arranged for Seraphine to be publicly humiliated at a charity function Valen's household was hosting. Cornering her near the coat check, one of the guests deliberately spilling wine across her uniform in front of a small audience, laughing at the maid who apparently thought she belonged somewhere she clearly didn't. Seraphine said nothing. She simply excused herself, cleaned the mess in a bathroom stall alone, and returned to work as though nothing had happened, because that's what people without power learn to do. Valen didn't hear about the incident until hours later from a bodyguard who thought he should know. What happened next terrified his entire staff more than anything he'd done in years. Not a single raised voice, not a single dramatic outburst, just a controlled, ice-cold fury that resulted in that particular family losing a shipping contract worth millions within the week, with no explanation offered to anyone who asked why.
Seraphine found out what he'd done from someone else entirely. When she confronted him about it, she expected anger or denial, or the kind of dismissive explanation powerful men often gave when they didn't think they owed anyone the truth. Instead, Valen looked almost embarrassed, an expression she'd never seen cross his face before. "Nobody treats you like that in my house," he said simply. "Nobody treats you like that anywhere if I have any say in it." "You can't keep doing that," she whispered. "Every time you protect me, you make it more obvious. People are already talking, Valen. Your family, your alliances, I'm putting all of it at risk just by being near you." "Let them talk. That's easy for you to say. You have power. I have nothing to fall back on if this destroys everything for you." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to hold his gaze, close enough that the distance between a Mafia boss and his maid felt for one suspended moment like it didn't exist at all. "You're wrong about one thing," he said quietly. "You have more than you think you do, more than you know." She didn't understand what he meant, not yet, but the weight behind his words, the specific, careful way he said them, like a man choosing not to say something larger, planted a question in her mind that would take root and grow over the following weeks. What exactly did Valen Moretti know about her that she hadn't told him herself? That question would eventually crack open everything, because within days, an approach came from an unexpected direction entirely, a woman claiming to represent an old family friend, offering Seraphine information about her past that would change everything she believed about who she really was, and why the most feared man in the city had chosen for months to protect a secret instead of speaking it aloud. The woman found Seraphine on her day off, in a coffee shop 3 neighborhoods away from the mansion, close enough to feel safe, far enough that nobody from the household would recognize her. She introduced herself only as Marguerite, middle-aged, elegant in a way that suggested old money rather than new, with eyes that studied Seraphine like she was assessing a piece of jewelry for authenticity before making an offer. "You look exactly like her," Marguerite said without preamble. "Your mother. I knew her once, a very long time ago." Seraphine's coffee cup froze halfway to her mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I think you've known for years, even if nobody's ever said the words to your face." Marguerite slid a photograph across the table, faded, decades old, showing a man with Seraphine's exact eyes standing beside a woman Seraphine had never seen before in her life. "Your father built one of the most powerful criminal networks this city has ever seen, and 11 years ago, someone had him killed for it, along with almost everyone who carried his name." Seraphine's hands trembled around the photograph.
Every instinct told her to walk away, to dismiss this as some elaborate scam targeting vulnerable people with fabricated stories. But something about the man's face in that photograph tugged at a memory buried so deep she'd convinced herself it was just imagination, a half-remembered lullaby, a specific cologne, a house that existed only in fragments of dreams she'd stopped trying to interpret years ago. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed. "Because you're not safe anymore, dear. Whoever ordered your family's destruction has learned you're alive, and they know exactly where you're living." Marguerite's gaze flicked toward the mansion's direction, though she never said Valen's name aloud. "You should also know something else. Your inheritance never disappeared. It's sitting in accounts and holdings that would make even Valen Moretti's empire look modest by comparison. Certain people would very much prefer that money stayed lost, along with you." That conversation changed everything, and not in the way Marguerite likely intended.
Seraphine didn't run. She didn't panic and vanish the way a frightened woman with a target on her back might reasonably be expected to. Instead, she went straight back to the mansion, straight to Valen's study, and demanded answers with a directness that surprised even herself. "Did you know?" she asked, voice steady despite the storm underneath it. "About my father? About who I really am? Did you know this whole time?" Valen's silence lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. "Yes," he finally said. The single word landed harder than any explanation could have. "How long?" "Since the day you walked through my doors." Something broke across her face. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to grief. The particular devastation of realizing that 8 months of quiet trust had been built on a foundation with a hidden crack running straight through it. 8 months, Valen. 8 months of watching you protect me, of wondering why, of thinking maybe I was imagining things between us, and you knew who I was the entire time? I was protecting you. By lying to me? By keeping you alive, he said, voice rising for the first time since she'd known him. Do you have any idea what happens to people who carry your last name in this world? Your father built an empire that made him more enemies than allies. When he died, 3 separate families tried to hunt down anyone who might inherit what he left behind. I've spent 8 months making sure none of them ever connected the dots to you. You should have told me. Tell you what, exactly? That the woman scrubbing floors in my mansion is sitting on an inheritance that could restructure half the criminal networks in this city? That people would kill you the moment they confirmed your identity? I made a promise to keep you safe, and telling you the truth would have put you in more danger, not less. A promise to who? That question stopped him cold. Valen's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he seemed to be deciding how much more truth he was willing to hand over in a single conversation. Cash or jewelry, but a single question directed at the terrified household staff being herded into the hallway. Where's the girl who calls herself Vale? Valen arrived before anyone answered, weapon already drawn, expression carved from something colder than Seraphine had ever seen on him. What followed happened fast enough that she only pieced the details together afterward. A brief, brutal exchange that ended with 2 intruders detained and 1 dead, and Valen standing over the scene with blood on his knuckles and murder in his eyes that had nothing performative about it at all. "Who sent you?" he demanded, hauling the surviving intruder up by his collar. The man laughed, a wet, panicked sound. "You think this ends with us? She's already dead. The only question is how many more of your people died trying to protect a ghost." That single sentence set everything in motion toward the confrontation that had been building since the moment Seraphine walked through those doors 8 months earlier. Elena hadn't just orchestrated Seraphine's family's destruction. She'd also been the architect behind Valen's failed marriage years earlier, quietly feeding his ex-wife information and incentives designed to sabotage the union from within, ensuring Valen emerged from the wreckage isolated, embittered, and easier to manipulate into an alliance with her own family down the line. Every calculated introduction to eligible heiresses, every push toward a marriage of convenience had been Elena's long game, patiently constructed over years, waiting for the right moment to finally claim the empire she believed should have been hers from the start. Discovering that Seraphine had somehow ended up under Valen's protection, completely unaware of her own inheritance, must have felt to Elena like watching a decade of careful work threaten to unravel overnight. She's been playing both of us since before either of us knew her name, Valen said, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, voice hollow with the particular fury reserved for realizing you've been manipulated for years without ever suspecting it. What happens now? Seraphine asked. Now we finish this, properly. Not with more bodies showing up in my hallways, and not with you hiding in some safe house for the rest of your life. He explained his plan carefully, methodically, the way a man does when he spent his entire adult life learning to think 3 steps ahead of anyone hunting him. They would draw Elena out into the open, somewhere public enough that she couldn't risk violence without exposing herself completely, somewhere symbolic enough that her downfall would matter to everyone who needed to see it happen. The same ballroom where this story had already begun once before, in a moment none of the guests that night would ever forget. You want to hold another gala, Seraphine said slowly, understanding dawning. I want to finish what I started the first time, Valen corrected. Except this time, everyone in that room is going to understand exactly who you are and exactly what Elena Castellano did to both our families. No more hiding, no more protecting secrets that only ever gave her power over us. Seraphine's hands trembled, but not from fear this time. Something steadier had replaced the panic of the past several days, a resolve that had been building quietly ever since Marguerite first slid that photograph across a coffee shop table. She was done being the invisible girl scrubbing floors, hoping nobody powerful would ever notice her. Her father had built something real, something worth protecting, and it was time to reclaim it instead of running from it. If we're doing this, she said, I'm not standing in the corner while you handle everything alone. This is my family Elena destroyed too. Valen studied her for a long moment, something that looked almost like pride flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. Then we do it together, both of us, in front of everyone who ever doubted you belonged in that room. For the first time since the breach alarm had torn through his mansion, something like hope settled between them. Fragile, uncertain, but undeniably present. Whatever came next, they wouldn't face it as a mafia boss protecting a secret and a maid hiding from her past. They'd face it as 2 people who'd found something worth fighting for, standing together, finally on equal ground. The second gala Valen Moretti hosted in that ballroom drew an even larger crowd than the first, partly out of genuine business obligation, and partly, everyone privately admitted, out of sheer curiosity about whatever scandal might unfold this time. They didn't have to wait long. Elena Castellano arrived exactly as expected, dressed in midnight blue, moving through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman who'd spent years believing herself several steps ahead of everyone in the room. She found Valen near the champagne fountain, offering a smile sharp enough to cut glass. I'm surprised you invited me after everything that happened last week, she said. Break-ins, rumors, dead men found in your East Wing. Terrible business, Valen. I do hope your little maid is recovering from the shock of it all. She's recovering just fine, Valen said, especially now that she knows who arranged it. Something flickered behind Elena's composed expression, gone almost as fast as it appeared. I'm not sure what you're implying.
I think you understand exactly what I'm implying. Valen's voice carried just enough to draw the attention of the small crowd gathering nearby, sensing the same electric tension that had gripped this room during the last gala. 11 years ago, you had a rising crime lord murdered because his empire threatened your family's fragile hold on this city. You made sure his daughter disappeared so thoroughly that even her own memories couldn't piece together what happened to her. And when my marriage collapsed under circumstances I spent years blaming entirely on myself, it turns out you were pulling those strings too, weren't you, Elena? The room had gone utterly silent now, every guest straining to hear a confrontation nobody had anticipated, but everyone desperately wanted to witness. You have no proof of any of this, Elena said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steel. That's when Seraphine stepped forward, no longer wearing a maid's uniform, dressed instead in something that finally matched the gravity of who she actually was. Whispers rippled through the crowd immediately, recognition dawning on the faces of older guests who remembered a name from over a decade earlier, a name they'd assumed had vanished into history, along with the family it belonged to. You murdered my father, Seraphine said, voice steady despite the weight of every eye now fixed on her. You destroyed our entire family, and then you spent years making sure nobody ever connected the dots back to you. I have documents recovered from my father's old associates. I have testimony from people who worked for you back then, people willing to speak now that they know I'm alive to hear it. And I have this." She produced a small drive, holding it up for the crowd to see, though only a handful of people close enough would ever know exactly what evidence it contained. Financial records tracing Elena's involvement back through over a decade of carefully laundered transactions, communications proving her role in orchestrating both tragedies that had shaped Valen and Seraphine's lives long before either of them ever met.
Elena's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. "Your father was going to destroy the balance of power in this city. Everything I did to protect what generations before me built. You have no right to stand here and judge decisions that were made to preserve order." "Order," Valen repeated, something cold and final settling into his voice. "You destroyed my marriage to isolate me, hoping to bind our families together once I was vulnerable enough to need an alliance. You murdered a man and hunted his daughter for over a decade, all so your family could hold on to power a little longer. There's nothing orderly about any of that. There's only cruelty, dressed up as strategy." Security guards, who'd been quietly positioned throughout the ballroom for exactly this moment, moved in before Elena could attempt anything more than a hollow threat. Rival families who'd once dismissed rumors about her involvement in old tragedies now watched with expressions ranging from shock to quiet vindication, years of unexplained deaths and mysterious betrayals finally making sense in the space of a single devastating confrontation. By the time authorities and rival family representatives finished sorting through the fallout in the weeks that followed, Elena Castellano's empire had collapsed entirely, her allies abandoning her the moment her carefully hidden crimes became public knowledge. The underworld she'd spent years manipulating turned on her with the same ruthless efficiency she'd once used against others. For Valen and Seraphine, the ending looked nothing like either of them could have imagined 8 months earlier. Seraphine reclaimed her father's remaining holdings, not to rebuild a criminal empire, but to finally close the door on a tragedy that had haunted her entire adult life without her even understanding why. Valen stood beside her through every step of it, no longer a mafia boss protecting a secret, but a man who'd finally found something worth being honest about. Months later, in that same ballroom where scandal had first erupted and later found its resolution, they returned once more. This time for an occasion nobody watching could mistake for anything but joy. The same crowd that had once whispered in shock now watched with open admiration as Valen pulled Seraphine onto the dance floor, exactly like before, except this time there was no secret hanging between them, no hidden identity waiting to detonate everything they built.
"Same ballroom," Seraphine whispered against his shoulder as they moved together. "Different ending." "Better ending," Valen corrected, pulling her closer. Because that's really what this story was always about, underneath the mafia politics and murder plots and years of hidden identity. Two wounded people who'd stopped believing love could survive their broken worlds, finding their way back to each other anyway. Not as a mafia boss and a maid anymore, just as two people who'd finally found their way home. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one.